5 May 1944. A bar near the harbor is thick with cigarette smoke and the low murmur of an occupied city trying to pretend it is having a normal evening. At a cornered table sits a man everyone in the room knows by reputation, though not everyone knows what that reputation truly means. He is an informer. He has sold names to the Gestapo before, and he will sell more if he is allowed to live past tonight. A young man approaches from the bar, 2 drinks in hand, the picture of nothing in particular. He sets 1 glass down. He draws something from beneath his coat that looks, to anyone glancing across the room, like nothing more than a length of pipe. There is no bang, no flash that catches the eye, no echo bouncing off the walls to make heads turn, just a sound no louder than a knuckle cracking, and a man slumping forward over his own drink. The killer finishes his beer, sets down the glass, and walks out into the Copenhagen night. By the time anyone at the next table realizes what has happened, he is 3 streets away and gone. And this is not an invention of post-war fiction, though it reads like one. It is a documented method of execution carried out by resistance operatives across occupied Europe, made possible by a British weapon so quiet that men who pulled its trigger in crowded rooms walked out unnoticed by people sitting an arm's length away. The weapon had no proper name when it left the drawing board, only a project number and a purpose. The men who built it called it, eventually, the well rod. It killed without announcing itself, and in the silence it left behind, it changed the calculus of what was possible behind enemy lines. To understand why Britain needed a gun that made no sound, you first have to understand the problem with every gun that came before it. By the early years of the Second World War, Britain found itself fighting a war unlike any it had fought previously. Across occupied France, Norway, Denmark, the Low Countries, and further afield, ordinary civilians were being asked to become saboteurs, couriers, and assassins almost overnight. The Special Operations Executive, formed in July 1940 on Winston Churchill's now famous instruction to set Europe ablaze, was tasked with arming and training these civilian resistance networks. But arming a clandestine agent presented a problem that conventional military procurement had never had to solve. A soldier carries a rifle openly, supported by an army, with the noise of his weapon lost amid the noise of battle. A resistance operative carries nothing openly. He moves through checkpoints, past patrols, through streets where a single loud noise at the wrong moment could bring an entire German garrison down on a safe house, a wireless operator, or an entire network of agents who had spent months building cover identities. The existing solutions were hopelessly inadequate for this kind of war. Standard pistols, even when fitted with the rudimentary suppressors of the period, remained loud. A suppressed Sten gun or a modified Colt might reduce the muzzle blast from a deafening crack to something merely very loud, perhaps as noisy as a car door slammed forcefully, still audible through walls, still capable of waking a street. That was no good at all for the kind of killing SOE increasingly required, the silent removal of a sentry guarding a railway line before sabotage charges could be laid, the elimination of a collaborator without alerting his Gestapo handlers 50 yards away, the disposal of a single guard so that 20 more men could complete a mission undetected. Knives and garrots worked at point-blank range but demanded a level of physical struggle and proximity that many agents, civilians turned soldiers almost overnight, simply could not be trained to execute reliably or survive if it went wrong. What the resistance needed was something that combined the certainty of a firearm with the silence of a blade, a weapon that could kill a man from arm's length without anyone else in the building knowing it had happened. No existing weapon in any nation's arsenal achieved this. The challenge was not merely engineering a quieter gun, it was solving several compounding problems simultaneously, suppressing the muzzle blast, suppressing the mechanical noise of the action cycling, suppressing the supersonic crack of the bullet itself, breaking the sound barrier, and doing all of this within a package small enough to be concealed under a coat, simple enough for an amateur to operate under extreme stress and reliable enough to not betray its user with a malfunction at the critical moment. It seemed to anyone who understood firearms in 1942 very nearly impossible. The solution came from a deliberately unglamorous corner of the British war machine, a requisitioned manor and its surrounding estate near the town of Welwyn, north of London, designated Station 9. This was one of several secret research and development sites operated by SOE, staffed by engineers, chemists, and inventors whose job was to dream up the tools of irregular warfare. The man who took on the silent pistol problem was Major Hugh Quentin Allain Reeves, an engineer with a gift for the unconventional, the kind of mind that some have speculated may have partly inspired the fictional Q of the James Bond novels, though that connection remains the stuff of pub conversation rather than documented fact. Reeves and his team began serious development in the latter half of 1942, working towards a brief that sounds almost absurd in its specificity. A weapon chambered for a pistol cartridge, effective to 15 meters, whose discharge would not be recognizable as a gunshot to a listener 50 meters away. The engineering answer Reeves arrived at was radical in its simplicity. Rather than taking an existing pistol and bolting a silencer onto the end of its barrel, as every other nation's designers had done, Station 9 built the entire weapon around the act of suppression. The result was a slim metal tube, roughly 30 centimeters long and just 3 centimeters across, weighing barely more than a bag of sugar, perhaps 1.5 kilograms loaded. There was no visible barrel protruding from a separate cylindrical attachment. There was, from a distance, barely anything that looked like a gun at all. With its magazine removed, the device resembled nothing more sinister than a length of plumbing, or, as more than one resistance fighter later remarked, a bicycle pump. Inside that unassuming tube lay the real innovation. The short barrel, only around 8 centimeters long, was drilled with a series of 16 to 20 small holes along its length. As the bullet traveled down the barrel, propellant gas bled out through these ports into a surrounding expansion chamber before the bullet ever reached the muzzle. This single trick solved two problems at once. It robbed the bullet of enough velocity that it left the weapon traveling slower than the speed of sound, eliminating the sharp supersonic crack that no suppressor on Earth can silence, since that crack is the bullet itself breaking the sound barrier, not the gun. And it dispersed the explosive rush of gas that normally escapes violently at the muzzle, spreading its release across a larger volume, so it leaked out gradually rather than detonating outward in one loud rush. From that expansion chamber, the gas passed through a further bearing perforated with smaller holes into a diffusion section, packed with a stack of perforated metal discs, separated by spacers and several rubber washers. Picture a length of pipe stuffed with a dozen metal coins, each with a hole punched through the center just large enough for the bullet to pass, with soft rubber gaskets between groups of them. Every washer the gas pushed through bled away a little more of its energy, a little more of its heat, a little more of its violence until what emerged from the front of the weapon was not a bang, but closer to the sound of a heavy door latch closing, or, as one period account memorably put it, no louder than a finger snap, followed by a faint hiss as the last of the gas escaped. There was a cost to this brilliance, and the engineers were honest about it within their own documentation, if not with the men who carried the weapon into the field. The rubber wipes degraded with every shot fired through them, the bullet punching a fresh hole each time that never quite sealed shut again. After roughly 15 to 20 rounds, the suppression effect deteriorated sharply, the weapon growing progressively louder with use, which meant the well rod was never intended, and never marketed, as anything other than a precision instrument for very specific, very limited killing. Operation required a deliberate bolt action at the rear of the tube, turned and drawn back by hand to load each round and eject the spent case, rather than the automatic cycling of a conventional semi-automatic pistol. That bolt action eliminated yet another source of mechanical noise, the clatter of a slide racking forward, but it meant the weapon could never be fired rapidly. This was, by design, a one-shot weapon for one very particular kind of moment, fed from a small magazine holding between 6 and 8 rounds depending on the model, which doubled cleverly as the pistol's grip and could be slid out entirely, leaving behind that innocent length of pipe. Production began in 1943 at the Birmingham Small Arms Company, the Great Midlands manufacturer better known for bicycles and conventional service rifles, with further manufacture later spread across other English factories to keep output dispersed and secure. Exact production figures remain difficult to pin down with certainty, much of the paperwork having been destroyed, lost, or simply never centrally recorded given the secrecy surrounding SOE's weapons program, but estimates drawn from surviving records suggest somewhere in the region of 14,000 units were eventually built across the war's various marks and calibers, chambered variously in .32 ACP and later 9mm parabellum. If you are finding this story as remarkable as I do, a quick subscribe genuinely helps this channel keep digging up forgotten history like it. Putting a number on how many times the well rod was actually fired in anger is harder still, and any historian who claims certainty here is overreaching. What survives are scattered accounts, official after-action mentions, and oral histories collected decades later from aging resistance veterans. The weapon was parachuted to SOE and, eventually, American Office of Strategic Services operatives across an extraordinary geographical spread, from Denmark and France in occupied Europe to operations as far afield as Albania, and even, in small numbers, Manchuria. Danish resistance fighters used it against German sentries guarding railway lines and industrial sites earmarked for sabotage, the silence of the weapon allowing a guard to be removed without alerting his relief only meters away. French networks used it to eliminate collaborators and informers who could not simply be confronted openly without endangering entire cells, the Copenhagen bar killing being one of several similar incidents whispered about in post-war memoirs and resistance histories, illustrating just how close to ordinary life this silent violence could occur without detection. The psychological effect on occupying forces, where the weapon's use became known or suspected, was significant even if difficult to quantify. Sentries posted to isolated duty in occupied territory had to reckon with the possibility that death could arrive from arm's length with no warning whatsoever, a far more corrosive fear for morale than the distant menace of bombers overhead. Whether this fear measurably altered German deployment patterns or troop behavior across the board is not something the surviving documentation can prove, and honest historians resist the temptation to claim otherwise. What is documented is intent, design, and a body of credible individual accounts, rather than a comprehensive operational tally that simply does not exist. It is worth pausing here on what the documentary record can and cannot tell us, because this is a corner of history where the temptation to embellish runs high. SOE's own files on individual operations were frequently destroyed deliberately, both during the war for security and afterwards in a series of post-war archive purges that historians still curse today. Many of the men and women who carried the well rod into the field did not survive to give post-war testimony, and those who did were often reluctant, for decades, to discuss specifics that might still implicate themselves or others in killings carried out under occupation. What we have, then, is not a tidy operational log, but a patchwork. Official training manuals describing function and intended use in clinical, unemotional terms, scattered mentions in SOE country section histories, post-war interviews with surviving resistance veterans recorded in the 1970s, 80s, and beyond, and the physical weapons themselves, recovered and catalogued by collectors and museums long after the fact. Historians piecing together the well rod's combat history are, in a very real sense, assembling a mosaic from fragments, and the honest ones say so plainly, rather than papering over the gaps with invented certainty. Britain was not alone in wrestling with this problem, though it was, by most assessments, alone in solving it so completely. Germany experimented with suppressed pistols of its own, generally adaptations of existing service weapons fitted with detachable cylindrical suppressors rather than purpose-built integral designs, and these typically retained both a louder report and, crucially, the audible mechanical clack of a semi-automatic action cycling, a giveaway sound the Welrod's manual bolt simply did not produce. The Americans, working in close partnership with the OSS, actually adopted variants of the British concept, manufacturing licensed versions domestically and fielding their own roughly comparable suppressed pistol, the high-standard HDM, chambered in the quieter, naturally subsonic .22 caliber rather than .32 or 9 mm. The American .22 design arguably achieved comparable hush at the muzzle by virtue of its smaller, slower round, but sacrificed stopping power that the heavier caliber Welrod retained, a trade-off that meant operatives sometimes carried both, selecting whichever suited the target and the mission. No nation, however, fielded anything chambered in a full-power pistol cartridge that matched the Welrod's combination of low report, total absence of mechanical noise, and genuine concealability as an everyday object. It was, by the consensus of post-war firearms historians, the quietest service pistol of the entire conflict, a judgment that has held up remarkably well across 8 decades of subsequent suppressor development. Assessing the Welrod's actual impact on the war demands the same honesty the weapon's own designers applied to its limitations. It did not blow up bridges. It did not sink ships or shoot down aircraft. Its material contribution to Allied victory, measured purely in enemy soldiers killed, was almost certainly modest set against the scale of the conflict as a whole. This was never a mass-issue weapon, and its production numbers, even at the upper estimate of 14,000, are dwarfed by the millions of conventional rifles and pistols manufactured by every combatant nation. Its true significance lies elsewhere, in the kind of warfare it made viable in the first place. The Welrod gave SOE and resistance networks a tool that let small, lightly trained groups of civilians remove specific, dangerous obstacles. A sentry, an informer, a particular guard at a particular gate, without triggering the kind of violent reprisal that an open firefight would have invited on entire villages and towns. That capability shaped how sabotage operations could be planned and executed across occupied Europe, and the design philosophy behind it, suppression engineered into the weapon from the very first cartridge rather than bolted on as an afterthought, influenced integrally suppressed firearm design for decades afterwards, with the Welrod's basic principles echoed in Special Forces weapons used long after 1945, reportedly including service with British Special Forces well into the latter half of the 20th century. Surviving examples can today be found in collections including the Royal Armories and various military and intelligence museums in Britain and the United States, unassuming lengths of metal tube behind glass that give little visual hint, even now, of what they were built to do. Return for a moment to that bar in Copenhagen, to the man who finished his drink and walked into the dark. He is not a singular story. He is one data point in a pattern repeated, with variations, in railway sidings in Denmark, on roadsides in France, in the close confines of occupied towns across a continent at war, wherever an SOE-trained operative judged that the only way to complete a mission was to remove one man, quickly and without anyone else knowing it had happened at all. The Welrod was never going to win the war on its own, and nobody who built it claimed otherwise. What it did was something narrower and, in its way, stranger. It made silence itself into a weapon, engineered with the same rigor that went into bomb sights and code-breaking machines, built not to announce British power, but to erase the evidence of its presence entirely. Other guns of the Second World War are remembered for their roar, for the sound that announced an army's arrival on a battlefield. The Spitfire is remembered for the snarl of its engine overhead. The Lancaster bomber is remembered for the drone that sent civilians scrambling for shelters. The Welrod is remembered, when it is remembered at all, for precisely the opposite, for the absence of sound at the one moment that mattered most. Think of what that absence actually meant on the ground. To the people who carried this length of pipe under a coat through checkpoints manned by men who would have shot them on sight had they known. It meant a wireless operator could stay on air another week because the man who might have found her transmitter never got the chance to report it. It meant a sabotage team had the 90 seconds of silence they needed to lay charges on a railway line. 90 seconds they would never have had if a sentry's death had come with the crack of a standard pistol round. It meant a network survived intact for a few more critical months, passing intelligence that helped shorten a war measured in millions of lives because one man at one gate did not get to raise an alarm. None of this shows up neatly in a casualty count. None of it can be reduced to a single satisfying statistic. That is precisely the nature of the thing. Its value was measured not in what it destroyed but in what it allowed to continue undetected, in the catastrophes that did not happen because somebody, somewhere, died too quietly for anyone to notice in time. A click, a hiss, faint as a struck match. Nothing more, and somewhere behind enemy lines, a sentry who should have raised the alarm never gets the chance. A network of saboteurs gets the extra minute they needed. A collaborator who sold names to the Gestapo sells no more. Engineers in a requisitioned manor north of London spent the second half of 1942 solving a problem that every other nation's weapons designers had judged nearly impossible.